Upper Bay Area, and we're here with Jim Fadiman, who is a prominent psychedelics researcher and has been doing that work since the 60s. He's also a transpersonal psychologist and former president of the Institute of Noetic Sciences.
Right.
And also does consulting on creative problem solving with and without psychedelics.
Usually without.
And we're here just to ask him a few questions about the work that he does for the Evolver community.
Wonderful. I'm very happy to be with the Evolver community.
Thank you. So I'm going to dive right into a pretty deep question, which is, what are the primary factors behind the allowance and support of psychedelic research in this country, historically as well as currently? And what are critical factors in building support for that?
Well, what we tend to ignore is that since psychedelics were about as illegal as you could get, 23 million Americans have used psychedelics, just used LSD, another maybe 14 million ecstasy, and then all the scattergun of everything else. So there's a huge base in the population that knows two things. One is they're not harmful, and for most of them, they're positive. And so that's the base we need to start from, is to stop thinking that we're a cool outlaw group. We are a cool, huge amount of the better educated, more informed, more widely traveled people in the United States. And that 23 million people is only the United States. When I go to Europe, it's pretty much, again, a large percentage of the people I meet. And when I'm traveling not doing anything psychedelic, I have used psychedelics. That doesn't quite answer the question, but it slid around it in a way that I hope is useful.
Right, that helps build the support.
Yeah, so the support is there when we reach out.
Right, thank you.
And we may need to begin to think more like of a community that can admit its own existence. And the more we admit its own existence, the more it's okay to be what we're doing. And yes, we are involved, and have been, some of us for decades, in working with substances that are not yet legal. And that's too bad. But there clearly is some reason why millions and millions of people keep trying it. And this year there'll be 600,000 more people in the United States that try it for the first time. So the more we put out information, the more we make it safe, the healthier it is for all of us.
Have there been any studies or research that you know of to compare psychedelics used in the healing process with traditional psychology or psychopharmacological approaches?
Sure. Before things were illegal, LSD was the most researched psychiatric drug on the planet. So there was literally, when I got started, and I was only in the early 60s, Sandoz sent me a book of the first 1,000 studies. And what we know from the psychotherapy world is, in those days when it was all legal and people published, is that the overall feeling was it vastly accelerated conventional psychotherapy. Now, what we're also finding out is for certain conditions for which traditional psychotherapy and traditional psychopharmacology have not worked well or terribly, take post-traumatic stress disorder. We now have a couple of studies that shows, if you use MDMA, that people who have been, it's a wonderful term, recalcitrant, or they haven't been good patients, they haven't gotten better, and it's obviously their fault, get better. And seriously better. They don't get a little bit better. They move from being unable to be employed to being back to a full-time job and having a family and not being suicidal or alcoholic or addicted. So that's where I think the big area we need to look at is we got 700,000 people coming back from the wars with post-traumatic stress disorder, one form or another. We have something that might help an awful lot of them quickly before they harm themselves or other people. That's an area really to look at, because the data, there isn't too much of the new data, but it's very clean data.
Would you say that several different kinds of psychedelics work on a level of integration with the body, with spirit, and with culture that are unique to those medicines, as opposed to other forms of healing that are perhaps more accepted?
Yeah, the real difference between psychedelics, and we can all look at our own experience, is that they actually are learning tools. That when you've had an important inner experience, it is important not because it was fun or exciting or blissful or sexually fantastic. It's because you had some insights into who you were and how you fit into the world that allows you to fit in better and be more successful and to be more generous and more kind. And that's a learning experience. And the nice thing about learning is it doesn't wear off. There's a wonderful guy who had one LSD session 40 years ago. He was a serious, bad alcoholic. Hasn't had a drink in 40 years. And a documentary filmmaker was, filming him 40 years later, and they said, "Whoa, you have willpower." And he laughed, and he said, "No, I don't." He says, "I don't have any interest in alcohol." That's learning. And that's not something that meets the usual medical model, because the medical model isn't about learning, it's about physical changes. And that's just a totally different model.
Right. Given the amount of power and influence that pharmaceutical companies have, why haven't they focused on research with psychedelics?
Well, let's just take just an example. Turns out that it looks like ketamine, given once, allows people to instantly not be depressed. If you take an antidepressant, it's 2 to 4 weeks before it's supposed to be working. And you don't need ketamine every day. The effect lasts for, and I'm not sure of this, but it's certainly some weeks. So if you're a pharmaceutical company and you have something that people have to take every day, or people have to take one every couple of weeks, which product would you want to sell? So the problem for pharmaceutical companies is, one, a lot of these are simply natural substances. You can't patent a plant. The other is the economics are very different. The economics of what a pharmaceutical likes to be is like toothpaste. You have to use it every day, and you have to basically throw it away, so to speak. There's no recycling. Nothing. So you have to get all new stuff, and it goes on forever. And I'm using a nice model of toothpaste because if I say things like antidepressants and things for diabetes and for blood pressure, which you're supposed to take for the rest of your life, that's an incredible income stream. And if, for example, people who have strong allergies take medications every day to protect themselves. Well, I have a few stories in my files of people who had severe allergies and who took a psychedelic once, and they never had the allergy again. You're not going to find the company that makes the daily allergy medicine excited by what I just told you.
Related to that question, do you see pathways for legality in the U.S. of more indigenous type containers for doing medicine work? Like a lot of the research on legality or push for it has been in the field of like the FDA and the medical and psychology fields. Do you feel there's opportunity for working on that other front as well?
Well, there's actually a huge amount that can be done on that front. The one wonderful thing about the Constitution is it really makes an effort to separate church and state. The government, and I understand their problem, feels it's in a bind when a psychedelic is used in a church-like setting, because it is their job to regulate pharmaceuticals, and I think certainly they should. They shouldn't regulate religion. So what do they do when it's a religious pharmaceutical? And the answer has been that they fight for dear life to keep it regulated. And when the churches go to court, they win every time. So the more there are these churches, which are totally legitimate religious institutions, they fit under that exception to the regulation rule. And remember that the Native American church is totally exempt from the regulations about peyote, and there's about 240,000 of them. So we already have these exceptions building up, and to the extent that we take these substances seriously as spiritual substances and not try and trick the government by saying, well, my spiritual practice is to drop acid and go to concerts. They're going to say, come on, to the extent we're legitimate spiritual religious organizations, the government is is set up so that they shouldn't want to interfere with that. And those cases, remember, have gone to the Supreme Court.
What is your take on working with sacred medicine in the container of a festival or a music concert where people are working with, a lot of sound energy, as opposed to a more tightly held container in maybe an indigenous type setting?
The good thing about concerts is most people don't overdose. And we're talking only kind of doses. And people get in trouble at concerts, and the large concerts now try and have a group of volunteers who are really well trained, especially, say, at Burning Man, brilliantly well trained, to help people not get harmed by their own lack of understanding or lack of knowing what they were actually taking. And so concerts have a kind of moral obligation, as well as they don't want to get sued, for having a safety valve. I think it's, personally, it's infinitely safer to take it in a spiritual container where everyone is there, everyone knows what's going on. Most times when people make mistakes at concerts, if you ask them, it's that they really didn't know either what they were taking or how much they were taking. And that's no different from someone who, from a mother of a 7-year-old who calls poison control and say, my kid just drank all the maple syrup. What should I do? Because that can be dangerous. So people who take the wrong amount of a substance in any setting are likely to get in trouble. And so obviously a setting where knowledge is the first order of the day and caring is the second order of the day, and knowing how to help someone who can't handle the level that they're at is the third order of the day, works really well.
During certain types of psychedelic experiences, there are often experiences of other entities or beings. What do these experiences mean in relation to the predominant Western paradigm of reality?
Well, it's a funny game because the Western paradigm, the scientific paradigm, says all the other entities that all these people see don't exist. And then you say to the scientists, how do you know that? And they say, well, I believe it's so. It's actually a matter of faith. They don't like to say that, but that's really what's up. And then if you say to them, are any of you Christians? And they say, oh yeah, lots of us Christians. Are there angels? And then there's this moment of, I don't like the way this discussion is going. And then you say, are there archangels? Are there personal guardian angels? Every religious system that I know of also says there are other entities. And I'm talking, Buddhism and Islam and so forth. And every indigenous culture that I know of has the awareness there seem to be entities. And so, personally, I realize I've been brought up in the scientific Western world, which says there aren't entities. And I have to give that up because the shamans who seem to have, 5 to 50,000 years of experience say, I help bring entities in to help you, and look, I'm helping you. I bring entities in who can tell me something happening at a far distance, like where your brother is working in Guatemala, and they give me correct information. So I have to believe there's some way I got that information. And I ask the entities, and they say, well, yeah, we went and looked, and here's such and such. So I'm actually what I consider a real scientist, which is any evidence that comes in counts. And I don't dismiss something merely because it makes me uncomfortable or it says that my worldview may be limited. See, I grew up at a time when the atom had electrons and protons and neutrons, and we were done. Mm-hmm. And now, it's a cascade. I think it's like 31 particles. And I say, oh, I really miss the good old days. But I'm not around to say, well, those little particles don't count because things were working fine in my system as long as I limited reality to the little bit I could see. It's a little bit as if we said, well, there are no colors beyond the ones I can see. The electromagnetic spectrum drops off on both ends. And scientists know that they can't do that anymore. And they really can't do that with entities. And entities make everybody uncomfortable. Now, there's wonderful articles, which is how to catch a DMT elf. Right? And it's a really funny, silly article. And the person wrote it said, here's these ideas that have come in, and they're all nonsense. But these people who take DMT report these entities, and we really still don't know what to do with them. They could be a figment of nature's imagination, not of mine. So what do I know?
Right. I like the anecdote about science having a more limited paradigm of the atom and then that expanding to incorporate more, and how that could relate to religion and people who have been following a certain path opening to things that have so far been outside of that. For example, Christianity, and maybe that there are pagan, like more earth-based.
Right, and Christianity, after all, all religions were nature-based. And what happened with both Christianity and Judaism, and to some extent Islam, is they took the nature holidays and they made them into historical events. So Christmas happens to come at the darkest time of the year. And it's just filled with both pagan lore, and the thing I love about Christmas is it's filled with psychedelic mushrooms, which is Santa Claus looks just like Amanita muscaria in what he dresses, and he also kind of looks that way. And I have this wonderful footage of reindeer pawing at the snow to get at the Amanita muscaria, which they scarf, and then they may think they're flying. So there's this wonderful kind of psychedelic, fun stuff within these traditions, and so it's going to get easier and easier the more we acknowledge the actual roots of these traditions. And as the Dalai Lama says, all religions say you should be kinder. So there's no disagreements about basics.
With your work with transpersonal psychology, speaking of entities, do you know if there are any groups working on a think tank level and calling in entities to help them? I just think of how a healing circle sometimes does that to do healing work, and I feel like there's a lot of societal level and larger scale healing happening. Do you know of people holding a container that way?
Well, if we go back a step to what we all know is true, there's a wonderful saying, there are no atheists in foxholes, which is when you get in serious trouble, people who totally don't believe in any religious system pray. And most people, when they're ill, and someone says, may I pray for you? They say yes. And around many, many people who are ill, people pray for them. Now, that's, in a sense, bringing in the energy, so to speak. And we also have very hard-nosed research in transpersonal psychology. I think some of my graduate students have done some of this research, which says this kind of prayer at a distance, without knowing who it is, helps. Meaning you have two groups, one are prayed for and one aren't prayed for. And you have very sophisticated ways of measuring and so forth and so on. And the group who are prayed for do better in this health way. We also know you can do it with plants. You're nice to these plants and you say bad things to these plants. You planted them out of the identical bunch of seeds. You give them the same amount of water and so forth and so on. These plants do better. So we know that evoking higher energies is inherently beneficial, at least to plants and people. So we don't need to be transpersonal psychology out in a niche. We have to notice that it is commonly understood in the culture that whatever you're praying to seems to be willing to be helpful. Now, when the shamans say, yeah, it's a very individual thing, and I am in touch with entities who are very close to me in kind of capacity, and when you get to monotheism and you pretend there are no angels, then you say, well, I'm actually talking to the entire person that runs the whole universe who just is terribly interested in my mother-in-law's appendicitis. And that's a much harder argument from the science point of view and from the common sense point of view, rather than to think that there are somehow some energies that individuals like you and I can get hold of and that will like to help us. That's the nice thing. Remember, there are also devils in all these religious traditions. And when you ask the shamans, they say, well, of course. there are entities who like helping people. That's just what they like. Like you like coffee, I like tea. They like to help people. And they say there are also entities that don't like people. And goodness knows there's enough reason to not like people. So that in all the shamanistic groups that I know of, part of the work is to bring in the good, and the other is to make sure the bad doesn't get you. Now, we have a different theory called the germ theory, which is there are good and bad germs, and that if you're in the right physical health, the good germs, the good bacteria, the good microbes, the good viruses are on your side. And when you're not, when you're not as good a person, so you say you eat garbage, then you're more likely to let in the bad entities. Now, let me give you one. Mental health, let's try the same thing. Let's imagine that when you're depressed, it's like an etheric wound in your little psyche. That lets in the demons that live off of depression. And that what maybe pharmaceuticals do is make you unpalatable to the demons for a day. And what the shaman does is heal the rent in your spiritual body so the demons can't get in. And when you talk to shamans, they say, yeah, that's right. And you say, would there be demons for depression and a different demon for schizophrenia and a different demon for manic depressive? And the shaman says, are there diseases, are your diseases all one, or do you have different diseases with different viruses and different bacteria? So it's a wonderful way of thinking about mental health too. That yes, you do, you break up and your heart is broken, which means usually you lose weight, you don't sleep well, and so forth. Does that let in the depression entities? It's a fascinating way to think about it, and makes the universe, for me, just a lot more interesting.
Why did you write the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide?
I originally was going to write a memoir about all the interesting things I'd done during my psychedelic research days until I realized that nobody cared. But then I'd done so much research basically on myself and on that era that I realized I knew certain things about working with psychedelics that most people either didn't know or no longer knew. And I'd also been involved with all the areas of psychedelic research, and none of my research friends had been involved with all of them. So I actually knew a little about a whole lot. And so I wrote a book so we wouldn't lose ways of working with them for scientific problem solving, which most people don't know about, for microdosing, which most people don't know about, for psychotherapy, which most people know about, and then how to have the safest, best possible entheogenic sessions. And so that's why I wrote the book, so that I want, we all hope that the next generation can make its own mistakes. And so I hope I've saved a lot of people from making some mistakes. And so far, so good.
Thank you, Jim, for writing that and all the research you're doing and all the knowledge that you are sharing and creating. And thank you for talking with us today.
Well, I love being with you. So this was just wonderful. So thank you very much. Okay.